I know. Thank you, sir.
We'll call this meeting of the Delta Township Saginaw Highway Corridor Improvement Authority Board to order. Call the roll here. Calvin Jones. Here. Scott Berman.
Here.
Peggy Von Payne.
Here.
Tony McGaldy.
Here.
Ken Fletcher. Here. Chris Christopsey, not here. Laura Miller, not here. Rachel Singleton, not here, and Brian Tork, not here. We have a quorum. We have before us the agenda, any additions or deletions. If not, a motion to approve.
So moved.
Support.
Has been moved and supported to approve the agenda as presented. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion carries. Any public comment? Seeing no one from the public here to speak. We have the minutes from the October 10th, 2022 meeting.
Motion to support, yeah.
Been moved to approve, supported by Scott. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Nay. There, I don't want to say nay. Motion carries. New business, the election of officers. We had discussed originally that we wanted to kind of have a rotating system, so the officers would kind of all move up a slot. So if that's the case, Peggy will become chair, Tony will become vice chair. So we now need a new treasurer out of the two members who are present. Which one of you are volunteering to become the next secretary? Excuse me, I said treasurer, I meant secretary.
I'd like to nominate Scott.
Close it quick.
So, okay, so Calvin, you're making a motion to elect Peggy as chair, Tony as vice chair, and Scott as secretary, correct?
Absolutely.
And is there support?
I
Support.
support, yeah.
There is support. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. Motion carries. Congratulations to our officers for the 2023 calendar year. So with that, we'll move to item number 3, which is a placemaking listening session. So we'll turn things over to Suzanne and Brian at this point.
You have that very well down, you know that?
I try to keep things flowing.
Very efficiently.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen.
This is good. While you're doing that, Suzette, from our conversation last month, were you going to share the deck that you went over with us?
Sorry.
I thought there was.
Yes, we had talked about that and I
Yes.
forgot to do that.
Okay.
So, find the deck.
Thank you.
Provide the
last-
deck from last time.
Or the power deck, the PowerPoint deck from last month or 2 months ago? That was, okay,
About how-
yep.
Yep.
And speaking of the housing, was that report from Tri-County, is that still pending? I thought there was conversations about that report coming out and.
The last I heard, which was about 2 weeks ago, it was still pending. I don't know if you've heard anything new. But yeah, and I can check too. That whether that's through Tri-County.
Just another data point, that's all.
Yep. Yep, that's good.
Thank you.
Good. Yep. Okay. There we go. Okay. So talking about placemaking today, really, how do you build investment? We've talked about a lot about trends and what's been happening kind of in the marketplace. You've heard from commercial, real estate, interests, residential, other corridor improvement authorities, and had lots of inputs. But today is kind of interesting because I think it kind of brings all the pieces together when we're thinking about how do these pieces work and what do they look like. So there we go. Project for Public Spaces is a nationally renowned kind of placemaking. That's what they do. And so this is their definition of placemaking. It's a multifaceted approach to planning, design, and management of spaces. Involves looking at, listening to, and asking questions of the people who live, work, and play in a particular space to discover their needs and aspirations, And then you take that information and it's used to create a common vision for that place. And the vision can evolve quickly into an implementation strategy, everything from basically small scale, you can scale it up, you can start to see immediate benefits as you do that. So this diagram, I think, is particularly interesting because it goes from the center of place out to kind of where the key attributes that we think of, social being, the people, uses and activities, and comfort and image and access and linkages. And then it goes into what are these things? How do you feel about it? How do you characterize it? Whether it's stewardship or convenience or walkability or charm, those adjectives. So as you're trying to describe place, sometimes you can't quite put your finger on why that it makes it so great, but how you feel when you're in it. Right? It's that there could be vibrancy, there's a little buzz, there's activity, that you feel safe, right? That there's things that are nearby. So it's interesting because there's like the qualitative part, but there's the quantitative part, but there's also qualitative. It's these combination of things that us as human beings feel when we're in a place. And there's components to that really start to make it a place. And they kind of, in the dark blue area, they talk about how can you measure some of those things. So how do you measure that feeling as we think about it? A lot of the tactics that they talk about for placemaking aligns with retrofitting of suburban corridors and creating different places. And it has to do with kind of retrofitting and reshaping the environment we have. It's true for, it's also true for urban centers. It's part of this reinvestment, but trying to keep this authenticity of the place that you're at and really building on those strengths. But then also really the headliner is really making it more dense and diverse. And the texture of it starts to change. So if you're in a place that has lots of, and what I mean by texture, the buildings have details, the sidewalks might be interesting, there might be art, there might be different activities going on, but it gets down to the human scale. And so it's everything from, the brick size instead of huge jumbo bricks, right? How is it scaled and how do you feel when you're in it? So all these components that start to feed into that. So thinking about how you're reusing space, but then also the size of the space and the size of the street and that area, is it walkable? Is it connected? Do you have nature involved? Because that can really change how you feel about a space and a place. Thinking about how you get around and move within that space. So it's not just I get into my car and I'm driving someplace that feels kind of sterile, right? Because your experience is in your car. It's not in the place. Mm-hmm. And so you're out of your car. So you're thinking about pedestrians and bicyclists and people who aren't in their shell, in their little protective shell driving around. And so you're really kind of trying to humanize that built environment and then also recognizing that it's diversity in that place. So it's both of the users, so ages, abilities, cultures. So you're looking at how do all those things play into that, but also architecture. It's not, you don't have sameness. There's some different features to it. This one is interesting because they speak to the authentic storefronts and familiar materials, that attention to detail I mentioned. You can get into talking about exactly how do we describe those components. So windows, for example, are really, really significant when we're talking about building a place, because as people, you feel safer if you can be seen, right? And you can see others. So that, goes back all the way back to your hunter-gatherer days when you wanted to see the horizon so you knew what was coming, right? The same thing if you're in a building and you're trying to relate to what's outside, those windows give you that view. And if you're on the other side of the windows and you're on the outside, your experience of knowing that there's other people around you, you're not kind of isolated, really also adds to that. We talked about that public space variety, and in this list, they were funny because they also mentioned open containers, meaning social zones and beverages. So I thought that was funny. And actually it was just interesting. I was just in a township and they had an owner of a brewery come up and they had a Halloween prowl event with kids and everything. And they had their social zone in this little area and it was a huge hit because the kids are getting candy, the parents have their cocktails and everybody had a good time. So, but for the businesses, they found that their sales were almost triple on a typical Friday night. So it really did kind of make a difference. We're talking about kind of these, and I think you've seen this graphic before, but I mentioned the importance of density. So you're building all of these pieces together to really create this in your toolbox so that one is feeding the other. So you got this public space is starting to attract people to it. Well, then people might want to live nearby it. Well, if you get more people coming to visit and living there, then you have more mouths to feed. So your restaurants start to be more successful, or they need to have something to fix their table with. So they're going to the hardware store. And if you can get them to say, well, office use, now office use is changing dramatically from pre-COVID, but the real benefit is if you can get office use near the retail, then you have people eating lunch during the day, and then you might have the residents eating dinner. So that they all kind of feed together to really create that quality of life and that sense of community where people are interacting with each other on a regular basis. And they really start to kind of see themselves as part of a bigger community. And there's an economic value to this. So Chris Leinberger, it's the walk-up. I can send you a link to this one too. The walk-up study, it was done in the state of Michigan. He's done studies like this all across the country and tried to look at Michigan cities and quantify the benefit of walkability. And there's a premium that comes with creating things that are more walkable. And they demonstrate that time and time again. He actually designed, it was part of designing Walk Score. So if you want to know how walkable your neighborhood is, you can enter your address into Walk Score. Some real estate websites will even have that information. So there's the economic basis, but it even gets to value creation as we're trying to build those. And these are both in suburban settings where you've got the difference between an old Kmart that's used for a self-storage facility versus a very similar site they're both next to county drains. And it was redeveloped for housing. It's by a Meyer. And so they put 300 units of housing there. If you look at the sizes though, what's interesting is that the residential is actually at 2 acres less. The SEV is 12 million compared to 1.3 million. And your value per square foot, when you start adding it up, is over $38 a square foot for the apartments versus $3.33 for the storage unit. So when you think about how are we redeveloping and you go back to how many people are we drawing to this place? Because the people will generate the economic activity, both in the tax base, but also for the businesses surrounding it. So being careful about the uses that we think about. So instead of repurposing the Kmart for a self-storage facility, which doesn't provide any people living there, doesn't provide any jobs except for like the storage unit person, right? So there's no density of people that's going along with that use. And so when we think about how we then build that density, so we're supporting that whole ecosystem along the corridor, we really want to be careful about what it is that we're planning for and being very intentional about this expectation that we want something that brings lots of people and, or jobs, right? One or the other is great. You can have both, but really making sure that you're reinforcing that along a commercial corridor because that's where it matters. Does that make sense? Okay. And this other example is actually from Hudsonville, retail and bottom office and then residential. And again, $5 or $55.62 value per square foot versus $14.18 on a traditional strip mall, and it's on half the land. It's only on 2/3 of an acre versus 1.2 acres on the other one. And it always is fun because I just the Rogers department store site on 28th Street. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That used to be the largest department store in West Michigan. And they're trying to redevelop that part, and actually Wyoming's envisioning it as their new downtown. And actually, I have oh wait, I don't want to wreck the headline. I just realized I remembered I have this in here. So I talk about maximizing that value, increasing the tax base. You're repurposing your existing infrastructure, right? So instead of extending it further out, you're being more fiscally responsible by getting more density and reusing the infrastructure you've already invested in as a community. And then you're also looking at kind of our communities are changing rapidly with their demographics. So we've talked about some of that. So you're really trying to accommodate everyone. And then certainly as you're reducing those vacancies and underutilized properties, you're improving safety, but there's also safety in numbers. When we think of safety, that when there's more people around, generally there's less criminal activity because it's not a no man's land and it's vacant and you've got those voids. So 28th Street, I almost wrecked the punchline. Almost did. Rogers Plaza was the first. There's Rogers Department Store and Rogers Plaza, which is right across the street. Rogers Plaza was the first enclosed mall in Grand Rapids. They had the first McDonald's right by there. They had Studio 28. Which Studio 28 at one point was the world's largest movie theater complex. So, but I said I have world in there too twice. Oops. So they could see 6,000 people. It still holds the record for the largest viewing of a movie ever, which was Home Alone.
Wow.
So they're in the Guinness Book of World Records. But so what's super interesting though is if you look at the last bullet from 1996 to 2008, attendance fell 75%. So, right, you're just crashing.
Yeah.
So I mean, you've got some, you see some parallels with malls, right? We have another story about another mall at North Kent Mall opened. Well, now it's 52 years ago. Opened 52 years ago, closed 22 years ago. Right, it had a 30-year lifespan, and then poof, it disappears. So kind of the same, it starts to drop. So they have 30,000 vehicles, so actually less than you guys do. It's also a state truck line. And so when they looked at kind of when things started in the 50s to today, they saw a lot of disinvestment. And then they started planning about how do we reimagine this? What do we think about it? How do we reconfigure and reposition this corridor? Because it's not going to be the same. A lot of longtime members would say, oh, well, this is the premier retail corridor. Like, it was the premier retail corridor. It was at one point, it was the longest retail corridor in the world too. So, but they've had to change it. So they also looked at demographics. And I think this is interesting, especially when we think about the east side of Saginaw Highway. And they started looking at the census data, and that's something we haven't gotten into yet, but I think it's super interesting to think about, is this impact on the neighborhood surrounding it, right? So if you start getting disinvestment in your retail corridor, it kind of spreads. It's not a vibrant place. People aren't saying, well, this is really someplace I want to buy in and I want to invest in. This is where I can afford to live, right? It gives you different choices. And so they found that there's a high housing cost burden, low rates of vehicle ownership. So 1 out of 5 households don't even own a car surrounding this area. And then the vacancy rates are high as well for retail. And what makes it really difficult is with big box retail, because most people, if they're smaller businesses that want to lease, are not looking at an empty Best Buy. They can't afford an empty Best Buy. They just want 1,000 square feet or 2,000 square feet, not 25,000 square feet. So the spaces become really hard to repurpose in a lot of ways. That's why you had the Kmart turn into a self-storage facility, because what else if it's not used for a church or a self-storage facility, what else do you use them for? Or in some cases, some retailers will put restrictive covenants or deed restrictions on the property. Like Walmart, you can't sell anything Walmart sells. And they moved across, so what do you do with it if I can't sell anything Walmart doesn't sell, right? And then they'll say, oh, well, yeah, give us a tax break on it. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, poor us. Now we're burdened with this property that we deed restricted so badly, you can't use it. And so and then the challenges that you've got, automobile, very auto-centric. In some cases, there's restrictive covenants or deed restrictions or easements that burden these properties in a lot of different ways. And that you really kind of it's a barrier, right? It's not this edge where you're comfortable as a pedestrian walking across, right? So you're trying to kind of navigate how do you deal with higher speeds and higher volumes. And so they looked at kind of the connectivity for persons without vehicles and where the underserved neighborhoods are at, as they're looking at what they've defined as their city center, which is just to the west of 131. And so you look at some of these census tract groups and you see like, there's some significant poverty in some of these areas. And then, well, here's the poverty one there. So this is where, they're surrounding there, and you want to be able to provide people with economic mobility so that they have the opportunity to find jobs and they can go there. But you need to have things, in this case, they have transit, they have a crosstown route, but how do you increase that and again, improve that connectivity for them? So Wyoming City staff set out to provide connections and trail network, improve mobility, and try to increase housing supply. And so they had that as part of their, part of the plan. So they had the Turn on 28th Street sub-area plan that was done in 2012, so 10 years ago. And then they updated their master plan. And I know one thing Nicole will tell you, she's the Nicole Hofer, she's the planning director. Sometimes these things take time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. And so they've been very, very patient, but part of it is also the right mix of people. They have a different city attorney now. The city manager is, he's close to retirement, so he doesn't care. Like, he's like, we're just gonna be bold and do crazy stuff. And so their focus has really been on this people, place, and commerce, right? How do you get that density, get some housing affordability in there, have some new retail that's proportioned correctly, and you have those green space elements and create destinations and jobs. So 131 to the east, and then this is the section that they're looking at for their town center that they described. And this is that portion. So City Hall is right here. If you can see my marker. They started to develop a street, which is this. This is a brand new street. This is the old Studio 28 site. So the city actually acquired the property and said, we want to control what happens to it. And then they started looking for a developer to do that. And so they found a housing developer who's now invested $60 million in the site and is doing a lot of residential. Right now, they're LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit projects, but he's adding market rate into his next phase. But he needed to be able to get comps and get something started to be able to make the numbers work. And what's super interesting is that he'll talk about his tenants, and they're the nurses from the hospital nearby. They're the office workers down the street, they're school employees. So really, it's truly workforce housing, and it's people who are already in the community that have moved in. So he's really filling this need of what the community sees they have. And
which is good, but I'm not seeing any green space. It doesn't look necessarily very walkable or anything. So it doesn't seem to be matching up with the vision, except for it's bringing people to live there, which is good, but it looks like a sea of asphalt, like everything around it.
yeah, so part of that is the design, and part of this is newer. Like you have it, he hasn't put in the grass yet, I think, in this one. There is this park here. And so when they were looking at partly connecting the neighborhoods and the people, and then connecting the people to the green space, they have a plan. Maybe I can forward it.
Isn't that the old Rogers High School?
Probably
They're behind the field. I only know because
in the back.
my daughter was offered the job to coach to manage this property.
Yeah.
Just last week.
Oh,
She
really?
turned it down
Oh, that's interesting.
for a different story because it was going to just be too time consuming. But she coaches at Wyoming High School.
Oh,
And my
yeah.
mom taught at Rogers and just trying to get,
Oh, funny.
yeah. I think that's the old Rogers High School field.
Yeah. So they talk about income and the price points. This is the income range that they're serving right now. They have almost 400 units. I mentioned the healthcare workers. Almost half are at ages 22 to 29,
Well, young professional.
which is interesting.
Mhm.
So that connectivity piece to the green space. So they have identified this Pinery Park and connecting across, there's your Wyoming High School. And then thinking about how do you connect all these things to the university, Rogers Plaza, and have it kind of cross over. And so this is what they were working on right now. They have just received $6 million in ARPA funding from the county.
What kind of funding is that? I'm sorry.
The COVID money.
Oh,
Yep. For infrastructure. And they are building this crossover that what's interesting about the site is on the south side, it's higher. So they can kind of almost come in level without having to do all these ramps on the side that you see. They can come in and take advantage of the grade and go over 28th Street. Usually you don't want to do a lot of pedestrian bridges over roadways because they're typically not used, right? They're a huge asset you have to maintain. But in this case, it's part of their trail system. So they specifically identified their trail system, how this then connects to Pinery Park. It also connects to the population that they have. So it does provide really transportation across 28th Street, but then they're also using it as a gateway element for their downtown. So it's going to be flashy and cool looking, and they'll do different things with it to really kind of make it kind of a marker. When you have such a big roadway, how do you kind of make it stand out? So their plan is to do that, and they're well on their way. We're designing it right now. For
And
them.
did the bridge cost 6 million or more? Or?
It'll be more. I don't remember the amount. I want to say like 10. It's not cheap. No. And their plan had, they wanted to put another one over here by the department store, and we're going, yeah, I think one is good. Like, you don't think you need another one, but we could talk about how to enhance that crossing and put a signal there and do some improvements. But some of those bold ideas, right? If you don't have it in the plan, and if you haven't like tried to pursue something like that, then it'll never happen. So this is what they're working on. Another quick example, City of Southfield. You may be familiar with this, Northland. It closed in 2015. What do you do with Northland, right? Huge parcel, 125 acres. And so they started doing community engagement, started doing a market study. So when we talk about the different components that you might want to think of when we're talking about kind of what are those things that we both put in the work for the CIA, anticipating what you might want out of that, but then what level of importance do you get in as far as funding priority? But they did a market study to look at support for redevelopment of the site, what kind of uses they should try to attract to it, and the densities that they should be looking at. And they did a full site analysis of that. And they developed some clear urban design principles that they were hoping to achieve. And you start to hear some of the same themes that we talked about with placemaking, right? The walkability, the public spaces, the street system that's defining those spaces. You want it to be compatible with existing land use patterns. That's one we didn't talk about. But thinking about how do you take advantage of the topography, think about adaptive reuse, those. So they kind of set those benchmarks and then set goals to those. So their redevelopment plan, because it's 125 acres, which is gigantic, they broke it into different zones for different types of districts to think about the bigger parcel in smaller pieces, right, with their own identities. And so their master plan has like a section for each one of those colors that you see that specifically describes the character and feel of what they're hoping to achieve. But you can start to see there's still quite a bit of parking, but you can start to see this public space, right? Then you got framing the public space. You have these edges that are clearly defining the street edge and where those are heavy landscaping, different amenity spaces and different scales and different types of development. So that's kind of what they're thinking of when we think of these types of settings. So implementation, when we look at your strategic plan goals, this is the old list, and I have the new list in here, but from a couple of years ago, some of the township strategic goals were to improve the appearance and encourage redevelopment of the Saginaw Highway. Think about the mix of businesses and attracting quality businesses, exterior facades of commercial buildings, reduce vacancy rates, continue to maintain Broadbent Road as the west commercial boundary, improve traffic flow and safety, and then maintain an attractive industrial area with a solid tax base and employment opportunities. So again, some of the same themes we heard, right? Jobs, clearly defined areas, that quality and those details matter when we're thinking about exterior facades to try to get to the redevelopment. And then more recently with the strategic plan goals based on community vitality, community connectiveness, and infrastructure. So we've talked a lot about infrastructure already, but how do we make Saginaw highways safer and more of a place? So certainly MDOT's in their investment, as you heard in the listening sessions, they're going to be looking at a boulevard design or something else. So being really involved in that process can click that off. But for community vitality, some of the strategic goals that the Township Board identified, they've identified some things for Saginaw Corridor, including looking at past studies. So that is something that we could also do, is looking at that. The placemaking strategy workshop findings are in here as well. But the corridor analysis, the town center feasibility study, and then working on kind of this improvement study for working with you on beautification and visual enhancement of the corridor, looking at utilities, researching burying utilities is on the list. And then really that thriving business, right? What else do we need to do to support businesses? And we heard in the listening sessions, you can support businesses by also providing places for people to live, right? That those are synergistic. And so how do those things go together? And how do we monitor it? Community connectiveness, really the identity and branding of Delta. How do we build that? And how do we think about that for the Saginaw corridor? A marketing strategy or build excitement and desire to invest. People are aware of it. Community events were identified. Public art was identified as some different art opportunities, and even Lansing Mall was mentioned in the list.
These all came from our initial conversations. Is that right? One of our first exercises.
So I don't know how much was brought in when you did the strategic plan, but so this is the township board adopted this as their strategic plan.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So they have those three, it is grouped by those three things.
Good.
So the key thing, obviously, we had a focus on the Saginaw corridor even before there was a corridor authority.
Okay.
So this helps implement that
Yeah.
vision that was laid out before it was created.
Good.
So you're in alignment.
Yeah, it looked like it was pretty darn close.
Yep, so that's good. And the revitalization toolkit that was mentioned in the prior section. So the toolkit has some recommendations in there. I pulled the quote that seemed most pertinent to this. The revitalization toolkit that you looked at really three different scenarios, kind of more of a more urban context, more of a suburban context, or mid-century and first tier suburbs, and then I think more of an emerging context. So they said on these corridors, the key will be finding dated strip malls or working with owners to redevelop, energize, or re-tenant them. And then to intensify the sites with new buildings that offer a mix of residential, retail, or office. Thinking about focusing on structures into smaller spaces, right? So you get more per square foot, they're in higher demand, and they allow an owner to tenant mix for an identity and brand. And then they give some ideas about whether it's around health and wellness or restaurants, what are those things that you want to take advantage of and target accordingly the right tenant mix for those sites. So again, a lot of stuff that we just already talked about, but kind of that's kind of the recommendations that we also had from the toolkit. And so then looking forward, some of in the strategic plan, the older strategic plan, there were some challenges identified, and there certainly could be more added to this list, I think. So aging infrastructure, water, sewer, storm needs to be looked at. You've heard there's a lift station that needs to be replaced. There's some development that could happen, but it's being hindered by capacity. Don't have enough in some places. Thinking about that, we'll hear tonight, I think, more about the resources from Delta Crossings. So there is an impact with Delta Crossings not, continuing its build out right away on the CIA's budget. It's a challenge and stuff, but also an opportunity like any of these, but MDOT's looking at how they're going to be planning for the right of way. It's their street, but really it's important that you get what you want and you're engaged early and often, and you have a picture of what you want, because then you can negotiate with MDOT on that. So if you go like, oh yeah, this is what MDOT gave us, that may not be really what you wanted or needed for your community. So you're trying to balance moving cars with making a place, and those don't always work well together. I mentioned the aging and large footprint buildings, the traffic, right? It's a blessing and a curse. You get businesses that are going, they locate there because of the traffic volume, because of the traffic counts. But I can also feel like too much traffic, if you're trying to do a walkable environment, because it's so heavy on cars. And then when we talk about implementation and how this all happens, staff only has a certain bandwidth. And so you're trying to figure out all these projects and programs, and we could think of tons of things to do, but there are not just financial limitations, but capacity limitations for who's going to do that work. And then this is kind of just a more generic table, not specific to Saginaw Highway, but kind of turning those challenges into opportunities. So this just kind of shows a different side of the coin. I mean, the opportunities, the ability to capitalize on the surrounding neighborhoods. You already have people who live here. And how can we really create stronger connections from the corridor into those neighborhoods and reinforce that? And then it's affordable living. So, you could have a good workforce to support the corridor as well. And really creating a strong job center, which you have. You've been very, very fortunate with all of the major employers in the area. So how do we pull that in? You do have some transit, but there's potential. I think there's interest from the transit authorities for more transit. We had one, it was interesting because the rapid would end at the boundary between Plainfield Charter Township and the city of Grand Rapids, right? So Plainfield didn't participate with the rapid. And so they would stop at the city line and they would go back. Well, there was a mire about a half mile down the street. And so they have a new director from the rapid. She said, even if Plainfield's not paying for it, we're gonna run it to Meyer. And so they started doing it about 9 months ago, and their ridership went up 120%. Just from changing, right, where because you have these nodes. Meyer is a major node, and so Meyer, even their employees ride transit. So all of a sudden now you've created this link that you didn't have before that really starts to make the numbers work. And they said out of any of the lines that they've had, especially post-COVID, that this one is far outpacing and being much more successful than any of the other ones. So super interesting. So as an asset, how do you think about how do you use that again for movement of people? And then I think some of this, I'm pulling pieces of this from what I've said, but I always find it fascinating having, my roots are from doing very urban downtown Grand Rapids type stuff, but in neighborhoods too. The amount of land that you have out here and what you can do with it.
Oh, yeah.
People go, oh, I can only fit so much. You can fit so much stuff on those parcels. It's really phenomenal. And I think it's part of it's a mindset, right? But it's also trying to be also true to what Delta is. So it's finding that balance between, you're not downtown Grand Rapids, right? Or downtown Lansing. you're something else, but maybe neighborhood scale, but what's that scale and what's that level and intensity of development that you want, I think is a really important thing to figure out and to have talks about. So how do we get there? So there's kind of 3 buckets that they in the toolkit recognized. One was an organizational approach, building capacity, getting the public involved, looking at organizations that can help do the work, like the Corridor Improvement Authority, having a clear vision, having that plan so that you know where you're headed and how you're gonna do it. You've got tools with your zoning ordinance, right? So you have some regulatory structures that you can use and adjust, and you've already done a lot of that work. Actually, there's been a lot of good work done around that. Parking, of course, is always a good one to think about, and how much parking do you really need, or does the development community think about how much parking they're going to provide instead of government worrying about it. And then what are some of those physical improvements we can make to make it feel more human scale and encourage more pedestrian and biking and different activities that all of a sudden start to increase that vitality and that sense of connection people have with where they're at. And so these strategies were identified in the strategic, it's either the strategic plan or the placemaking. Maybe it was the placemaking piece, now I forgot. So it talks about purchasing and raising property, providing incentives. Some of the incentives, we made some of those decisions when we created the Corridor Improvement Authority. So things like a facade improvement grant can't be done by the Corridor Improvement Authority unless you were to change where you were pulling your increment from. And that would be a very big, messy process with all of the other partners. So, but you can focus on the infrastructure, right? Landscaping, signage, building that identity for the corridor, making sure you have the infrastructure to facilitate it. You do have brownfield, so thinking about how, if there's the right circumstance, you could use brownfield. Talking about it, thinking about how we tell the story about the Saginaw Highway Corridor and encourage businesses to be here. Again, thinking of the economic benefits, as they improve their sites, encouraging investment by existing owners to do that. Connections to the neighborhoods, to the commercial area. And then there's some longer term strategies that were identified. Burying power lines was one of those. And you know, it was in the strategic plan. It is not cheap, and that would basically be all of your money.
But that's why we put Calvin on this board, so he can come up
Right.
with solutions.
Thanks,
Your
Ken.
shovel on start.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Ken.
Calvin, it's almost Christmas. It's almost Christmas. Guess what Delta Township wants under that tree? Or under the ground.
Oh,
That's even
man.
better, right?
I agree with what you said earlier. It's not cheap.
Instead of the thing of nuts, can you just get the buried?
No chestnuts in each year.
Just go back to Dick and say, I promised them that we would do it.
Oh, jeez. Oh, man.
You
That's
do.
good.
What is nice about Saginaw High, so you guys, you do, even though we talk about this, you're like, how do you change this? How do you do this? You do have some nice setbacks in areas. You do have green along the road.
Yeah.
Not everywhere, but you do have more than most. And the power lines, yes, they're there, but they're not as bad and ugly as you can see in other places. So it's 6 to 1, half dozen the other, but certainly landscaping can hide a lot of sins. Right tree, right place. So I'm not saying put big, huge sycamores underneath the
Right.
power lines, but you can add trees along the corridor. I think that's going to be a good topic of discussion with MDOT. But then you also have that tension with store owners who might say, I don't want any trees. You have to see everything. There's studies that have been done on that. So, but also the MDOT reconstruction of Saginaw. trying to think about how do we transform pieces of property over time. There's this thing called tactical urbanism, where it's like, what if we did some light, quick, cheap fixes? I mean, some of it can be art, like murals, as an example. If there's side streets where you could play with outdoor dining, or you're improving the crosswalks in those areas, you're limited because MDOT won't let you do lots of crazy things, but you have the edges that you could play with. So are there things with the road commission that we can think of maybe that would be different than with MDOT to try to work into that infrastructure piece? And you have had a lot of discussions about infrastructure around those things. So, and then also thinking about in the future, do we talk about access management? Is there a placemaking strategy, wayfinding or wayfaring signs, branding? So looking again at those utilities, vacant properties and property maintenance, are there certain approaches or targeted approaches that you want to undertake? And again, the township's done a lot in that regard too. So just to wrap it up, kind of next steps. So we've had, in fact, there's a summary going to the township board tonight, which we'll distribute to you, that kind of for kind of an annual update. So we can share that with you. You can go back through and read, the input that we've had. And but I think knowing kind of what you're interested in focusing on, there was just a lot here, right? There's very, very rich. There's lots of places to focus. But part of it's also gauging energy and interest from the community. So where, you can say, well, I really, really want to do petunias all up and down the street. And if no one's interested in petunias, you could put that on your list and you'll never get petunias planted, right? So, so there's where are people energized about something, or it keeps coming up that you hear from people about, well, I wish this would happen, or I wish we had X. And then you can start to build on that energy. So it's not taking a whole huge list, it's where you follow the energy to be successful in this work. And then also are their partners. So we've identified some partners in our listening sessions. We heard from one quarter improvement authority in Meridian Township. They were talking about how they had partnered with CATA on doing crossings and doing improvements there. Partnering with MDOT, right, to do landscaping and other things. We had, I'm trying to think of other partnerships. Well, yeah, I already mentioned MDOT, but there's definitely those connections, and I think you heard an eagerness from everyone that came to talk to you about wanting to help you figure this out and what that is. So, and then certainly we have to work through timeline and how do you want to measure success, which I think is really interesting. That's the first slide, right? If you're trying to build place and you're trying to be successful, all that stuff comes together when we're measuring the right things and we're driving towards them. But it's not a huge laundry list. It's not like 40 different outcomes that you're trying to achieve. You need 5, right? It's
You gotta define it.
right.
Mhm.
Be very clear, and then if you're really successful, knock it out, then you can add another one. But you don't need a whole laundry list. So. So I think for you, it's just kind of where is there that energy and interest? What are you interested in focusing on? And kind of next steps, because we're going into a whole new year, and they'll have to know how much money they have to think about or don't. And kind of how do we start making changes?
Is there any place that has successfully done this? You had the examples of different plans and stuff, but is there anybody who has actually transformed the corridor?
Yes, but most of them are not in Michigan. So there's one in Washington. I can't think of the name of the community right now. But I can pull it up. It was very dense, and they had oh shoot. I'll send you links to it because it's super interesting, especially what is so cool is if you now with Google Earth, right, or Google Street View, because you can go back in time when you're looking at it. So you can say, well, this is what it used to look like. And then they decided to make these investments and these changes. And then you can go and say, well, this is what it's starting to look like now. And so there's one I found in, I think it was Washington. Minneapolis has done some interesting corridor work where they've been transforming kind of Minneapolis, St. Paul area. The tricky part is, especially where you have interchanges, because the volume of traffic and the speed that makes it hard is really a barrier where those interchanges are at to go along the corridor. But you certainly have areas that are not near it, especially as you go east, where you need the most investment that provide. I think that's really opportunity rich.
I guess I always get the experts, we'll see it, Kevin.
Later.
I know the experts always talk about, you know, the walkability and everything, and like, when I look at the Saginaw corridor though, I have a hard time envisioning that you're going to be able to successfully turn that into the pictures where you have all these people all mingling around, walking, you know, up and down the corridor and everything. And I the time that it takes, because, you know, been years now, we had a consultant look at different properties and talk about things that can be done. And of course, the owners have, in most cases, have no desire to do any of the things that they're talking about. People talk about the mall, but quite frankly, I don't think the owners of the mall has any desire to do anything different than, you know, what it currently is, just fill space, you know. So it's some of this stuff when you think about trying to like revitalize the corridor, the amount of time, the energy and everything, it really, you know, it becomes overwhelming in the sense of, can you really transform it, or can you do some minor cleaning up a few bad spots here and there and, you know, make it a little better? I guess that's where I kind of get hung up sometimes, that, you know, the visions are great. It's just, are they ever going to be able to really accomplish a big vision where everybody's all walking around up and down Saginaw?
Usually I would say, I think that's what's interesting about the 28th Street plan is they said, we're not going to really embrace 28th Street. We're going to create a new street, right? South of there through the shopping center and do something different, because trying to do it all on 28th Street is really like, that's not our main street. We're gonna have to create a main street. I think with the I property, you really got a unique opportunity because of where it's positioned, kind of in the middle. And it's a blank slate, right? So I think you could do that. And then the question is, how do things connect to that? And how do the neighborhoods, even though, you know, we've got to identify some clear areas where crossings are safe and people are comfortable, if, you know, as much as they can be. But how do you reinforce the connections to the neighborhoods and the businesses, even if it's on different sides, you know, on their own side of the road, and they may not cross, but you're reinforcing that. And you've got pieces like you've got the library has some interesting pieces to it. And so I think there's nodes where you could really focus, whether you own it or it's vacant or it's really underutilized. And at some point, if you have the right developer, it could happen. But it's not going to be all over. It's not going to be every site. And you're right, you're not going to have property owners. There's going to be some that are just perfectly content to let it sit there and do nothing.
Well, especially as we're seeing some of these properties actually are being sold at high prices and stuff. So I'm not necessarily envisioning anything too dramatic happen. You know, they're buying them to keep them exactly as they are, which is fine if they're full of, you know, good businesses, you know, that's fine, but it's certainly not transforming the corridor to this walkable, you know, it continues it basically as it is.
Yeah. And I think that's partly kind of where are you going to pick your battles, right? Where are you going to prioritize necessary investment? I mean, is there a strip mall that has just been languishing forever and, you know, the property owners on the verge of bankruptcy? You know, what is it that you could do, or how does that connect to a neighborhood where you're like, if we could maybe get that torn down, or, you know, even incentivize tearing it down, that might be an opportunity. But it's not going to be the entire corridor announced, and everybody's going to go, oh, I'm on Saginaw Highway and it's so bright and walkable, and I'm going to let my 2-year-old ride their scooter across the street. Right? This is the reality is that It's not gonna happen. The traffic volumes are way too high and the cars are way too fast.
I mean, Ken talked about at one time trying to get, before we too aggressively sought public feedback, having a starting point, right? So that to kind of grease the wheels, which I think makes perfect sense. And I know I continue to nauseatingly badger the fact that, I personally think that any project like this, despite the obstacles that clearly come with politics of, having some things that you can deliver in short term so that it spurs some of that excitement, even if it's to pick on Lansing and it took them 3 years to get a bus stop redone. Hopefully we can do better than that. But something that they go, whether it's art on side streets and they feel like, okay, this is happening. It may be a 15-year project, but we're seeing things. But my vision is today, at least what you said, whether it's the Lansing Mall or the Ide property or the school down here, or that there are nodes that could be developed and potentially pitched and sold to developers of here's what we think, here's our long-term vision. And you hope that somebody gets excited about it and says, yeah, we like your vision. We'd like to invest in it. We'd like to partner with you to develop it. And then we, through the branding and the non-motorized, which transportation, which seems to be important, along with extending the motorized transportation, bike paths and walking paths, tie those areas together. But your 2-year-old is sitting off in a Lansing Mall project that's off the road and has multi-unit housing and shopping and a ball field or an ice rink. And so they want to be there. But if they want to ride their bike to Brian's restaurant, there's some connectivity to do that too, right?
Yep.
I mean, and it just seems like to your point, you're gonna have to sell the vision, get feedback, and then pitch the individual concepts and hope somebody goes, yeah, we're in for 40 million. We want to help with the incentives, whatever incentives we're offering. So.
Yeah. But I think the key is having that vision, right? I mean, if you don't have a vision, then they can come in and do whatever. I think that's being able to express what that is. A lot of developers will say, well, they're not mind readers. And if you tell them what you want, if they think they can get easy approval and, and it makes sense for them, they'll gravitate towards that naturally.
Well, we've heard we're getting requests for housing, right? Because of all the great things everybody's done to attract jobs. So it does seem like the time is right.
I mean, how is that, the corridor with residential, and how much money do we have to really work with? I mean, it sounds like we're to the point where we're looking at developing a plan, a vision to start that conversation now. I mean, low hanging fruit. We need to piggyback on what else is going on in the corridor. If it's with the road commission, if it's with CATA, or if it's with MDOT, I mean, what are those elements?
Well, I think a couple of the elements are, one, we heard from CATA so that there are some potential plans to extend the public transit down Saginaw. They supposedly have some grant money to do that. We know at some point MDOT, now the section from the freeway down to Waverly is a little more dubious in terms of a time frame, but we know that they are going to be looking at that for reconstruction. So in my view, that's kind of a timeline to shoot for some of these type of infrastructure improvements, whether it's water, sewer, or some additional non-motorized or crossings. We do have some other non-motorized projects going. We'll have a crossing at South Mall Drive as part of another project through Tri-County. So that's one kind of safe crossing across Saginaw. Developing a vision for some of these who I think we have been getting approached. There's not a shortage of economic development or developers looking to do stuff. Some of the hang up is the and utility capacity in a couple of the projects
Mhm.
that were squeezed and can accommodate at this time are able to get improvements. That, so for like the I property, we have a consent judgment, we have somewhat of a vision for that. It's not necessarily laid out in a visual format of a vision, but you know, the problem with that continues to be somewhat of the ownership of the property, which hopefully should shake loose at some point. So that might be one good area of focus.
Again, I don't know that I'm right by any stretch of the imagination, but it seems like your question is what are next steps? To me, the next steps are creating, I view this as, although I agree that it has to be done in nodes, I think is the term you've been using, incremental nodes. They have to be tied together with some theme or vision, even if one project happens 3 years from now and the other one happens 20 years from now, there still should be a
We're not talking
vision.
20 years. We're talking-
So there should still be a vision, but I think the next step is to get the help and discussion we need to create that initial vision. And, you know, if one node is really heavily focused on, you know, housing and parks, and another one is on community entertainment and art, and another one is focused on, you know, independent private Michigan businesses. I mean, if we could get agreement on that and then get some mock-up drawings, then we could talk to some developers and sell them and hear how stupid we are and modify if we agree. So
I think that's one aspect. That's everything really outside the right of way, right? That's potentially if it's facade develop, you know, redevelopment and whatnot, but within the right of way, Brian, isn't there, you said 96 to Waverly, that's a long-term deal, right?
for MDOT,
With MDOT,
yeah.
but from 96 to Broadbent, has there been any more discussion there?
There has been that is a little more firm timeline. I believe that is the last meeting that we had with MDOT. That was, we're planning on that for 27, I believe. That is on their list, although it's I have to get the exact kind of vernacular for that, but it has not been designed yet, but it is in their scoping process.
I guess that's my point, though. You don't want them to go into design without us being a part of that.
Correct.
And to get ahead of that now,
Yeah.
you have a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Mhm.
So a year from now, you may lose that opportunity.
Correct.
So, I mean, to me, that's low hanging fruit to focus on.
Well, and you've been involved in a really transformational project,
Yeah.
and thinking what happens in the. right
Oh,
way
yeah,
with
that's
that
what
guy.
this is the time to jump in if the township, this board wants to do something, which is that model would go to the east, right? That sort of sets a framework. So that would be my recommendation, is to jump on that. Along with,
That's a good, no, it's a good.
yeah, so
point.
that's within the right of way, but outside the right of way, though, all those other elements, absolutely, but it really goes back to dollars, right? How many dollars would you have available to really do any type of impactful change? But at least within the right of way, you could work with the DOT to help facilitate those conversations, especially if you have stakeholder engagement up front.
Well, we're certainly capturing enough money to do some planning, roughly $160,000 a year right now that we're capturing. So we have some dollars to do some planning exercises and that type of thing. It's not enough to do real big projects at this point, but until we get into that process, I don't know what other monies will be available, depending on what happens.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, you got that, and then you mentioned CATA transit. Are they serious about moving it all the way to the west? What does that look like? Potential stops? Would we incorporate that within our plan or help facilitate that conversation? And then if there's any utilities in this area, I don't think so. I think the major utility problems are on the east side.
Yes and no, I mean, we do have some utility issues to the west.
To the west.
Not necessarily right along Saginaw, but that's the time to really think about if we do have to have some improvements, especially either crossings or upsizing. For that type.
When MDOT was here and talked about the projects, I mean, they did talk about that they had flexibility and if things prioritized, they could switch their order, but I felt like a lot of what was driving that was the growth of Delta crossings. So it might be good to get an update from them too on, I mean, I would like an update on what's going on with Delta crossings, but I wonder if that's gonna be, if change their thoughts, if that slows down a little bit, because I think they felt that was gonna drive even greater car traffic, and that was why they were moving it ahead of some other projects. I thought it was more like 25 or 26 for that part, but I could be wrong. But I don't disagree. Talking about that and CATA, probably you're right, is good, would be a good place to start. But risk of being redundant, I think tying that in with a greater vision so that we have a long-term view of.
Absolutely.
I love what you said. If you can get buy-in on that part of MDOT's vision and say, then it's just going to be natural to extend it to the east, whether that's 5 years later or what. So.
To get back to the Delta crossings part, if anybody's interested, that's actually on our agenda for the Township Board's meeting tonight.
Oh, okay.
Where we're gonna have attorneys explain all the various lawsuits that are currently pending and exactly what that means for the development and everything. Just kind of an update on exactly where things stand.
That's
So
what
you can either stay or just
You're
watch
not
that
smiling.
Zoom.
We obviously have another meeting, but towards that end on a separate note, but while we're still in session, are we going to be looking for a replacement for Chris? He does or doesn't have interest in being on this board, or?
Well, that's a topic that we'll have to definitely look into
Okay.
because obviously since his situation has changed and he obviously hasn't been here for a while. So, yeah, something we're gonna have to look at in the new year. So hopefully we'll get that resolved, it's worked out.
How long's your meeting going tonight?
I don't know, hopefully not too long.
Used to
It
get.
wasn't a lot on the agenda.
What was that?
Or did I
Just
figure
the
it out?
Delta crossing.
Yeah.
Oh.
Just.
Just, you have to sit through other items. But so it was interesting to me when you were talking about kind of the core, I mean, it made me think of kind of like, that's the spine,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then
Correct.
whether it's going to your hands or your feet or whatever, I mean, it's those different nodes
That's-
along it and how, but that's the unifying piece.
I would think so. Then, the county road system will come into play, and then you have the private developments, if there's opportunities, whatever property, right? Who knows? But if that vision that you were talking about, there's some elements to that somebody gets excited about. But actually, obviously it goes back to the infrastructure. If you have utility deficiencies, that's going to be difficult to attract new developers.
But you did in your plan,
Mhm.
put money aside for infrastructure, not just for Delta crossings, but for Lansing Mall. So but it doesn't necessarily have to be Lansing Mall. I mean, but if there's upsizing or something else that needs to happen, there was money and
Opportunity.
vision to go towards infrastructure.
What are
in
the,
your plan.
you mentioned briefly the brownfields and I think it mentioned a specific property, but what are the requirements that would qualify something to be considered for a brownfield?
So they, describe, I can describe it, but
Yeah, go ahead.
so really, obsolete property allows it. You can even see green, I mean, like what you would say is a green field, it's never been developed on. But like if there was an apple orchard and you find a little bit of arsenic, oh, it's a brownfield. So it's pretty liberal. In Michigan, our definition of brownfield is pretty open. It's usually pretty easy to make that threshold.
Just has to have the eligible
Yep.
costs, so something like it, so if the Lansing Mall or say the old school did a brownfield, the eligible cost would likely be demolition, mitigation of asbestos,
Remediation.
remediation of asbestos, lead. If there's any environmental cleanup, those are those are things that they could receive reimbursement through tax.
Mhm.
Scott, is your question though, if we are aware of those areas?
Yeah.
Can we leverage? I mean,
Kind of,
as a-
that may be additional dollars that are available to drive incentives to people to invest and develop in our area.
I was actually gonna ask not only about the brownfield, but the Michigan Economic Development Corp. Is there opportunities where we could leverage dollars to help stimulate even further revitalization?
I mean, we've accessed their commercial rehab programs through FCC. I have to look at some of the others. They have some other CDBG. Some of those only recently become eligible for, and so we have always been eligible for. But as far as like brownfields, a lot of it depends on the project or the size. I mean, realistically, I believe almost everything could be eligible in terms of a building, but a lot of the projects, it's kind of has to reach a threshold to make it worthwhile to go through the whole process. So it's, if you look at the corridor, the mall, or the old school, those are probably picture perfect things for brownfield financing.
What makes it work is if you have a low taxable value, right? So then your gain is, and it's hard, especially for townships, because cities who have income tax, sure, they can hand out brownfields like their candy, and they'll do tax abatements because most of their money is coming from the income tax, not the property tax. When you have a township, it's all property tax. So then the decision is how willing is the township board and for how long to forego that property tax when it's paying for services.
So we did do a brownfield across the street, the Hilton Garden Inn is a brownfield. So we paid for the demolition of the old hotel. Was estimated it was going to be a 10 or 11, 12-year payback. It looks like we're going to more like 7 or 8 years. So that's a pretty successful
That's great.
version of the project.
That's great.
There is, MEDC does have planning monies where they'll match up to, I think, $30,000 or $40,000. The hook there is you're looking to become redevelopment ready certified. So whether or not that would be a policy decision on whether the township wanted to be RRC certified. Now, that does have some benefits as far as if there is a redevelopment site that you want to advertise, that they try to reach different developers and increase awareness about opportunities for development. And then they also have, they have some really nice resources as far as technical assistance and other information, but that would be another thing to think about.
So timeline wise, what are you thinking? Because our next meeting is in January. What should that topic be on? Doing some more of this, of discussing really what should be our.
We have to figure that out.
Okay.
We haven't. Honestly, we haven't quite discussed it, and I think part of it's going to be, I would expect January, maybe it's more housekeeping with members, and you already approved the budget.
Yeah, we have the budget approved, officers, so we spent this year doing a lot of the listening sessions to kind of build up knowledge base and so now moving forward, I think we need to probably pull some of it together and come back with some.
I think we're getting to the point where we want to start moving in the process of the actual plan of looking at, getting consultants and stuff on board and stuff to start that process.
Yeah, and to Scott's point, I mean, as you've been asking for, where's the opportunities for the public to start weighing in? We did have an initial list before, and the listening sessions was kind of phase one. So you kind of just orient yourself to the different players and different things to think about. We can look at starting to do a community survey. It's super easy to do now with technology, and we do surveys a lot with QR codes. So we'll have them printed on bar coasters, and you can just have, everybody's now used to using their phone thanks to COVID to do that. And so that's been a really great technique. We're sending postcards in the mail with the QR code so people know it's a simple thing to fill out. And then the technology is really neat because then we can provide updates and you can see where, how many responses you've got. And then, so there's some different ways that you can do it that they're pretty simple, but it starts to give you more information to help make decisions.
Yeah, I, again, give credit where credit is due. I mean, I think Ken's right, or at least I agree with him, that you want to, if we can give people a rough idea of what we're thinking, it'll pull the people out of the woodwork who think it's stupid, right? I mean, they'll tell you, we don't like this, we want that. But I am a little fearful of going out with a blank slate and getting such a plethora of ideas that you alienate everybody because there's no way to pull it together. Versus the lone person who says, no, I can't believe you didn't put a Major League Baseball park in the plan. Like, okay, we hear you. We'll take that under advisement.
Little kid love nuts.
Yeah.
You really start some controversy. You're building your own stadium to draw the lug nuts up to Delta Township.
You make the stage real in no time.
I would support that. Just want to go on record.
Just have Ken say, I'm gonna buy
Yeah.
the team.
That's all you need. You'll have this place filled up before you know it.
The CIA board. With our champions of minor league baseball. Brian, you know how to run a baseball team?
I do.
You do better at that.
Brian feels a little beat up, doesn't he? Time of the year.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, we could come back with a couple different approaches to think about. So, and then maybe that will help you determine direction. It's not like this is, I mean, we can come up with a recommendation, but I think maybe kind of a menu might be helpful.
And to Tony's point, what would be the next steps and whether or not you could do that in January to get, whether it's CAT or MDOT re-engaged? What do we need to provide them to influence their direction or hear from them so we can draw some opinions about how to influence their direction?
I think we could invite them back. We've been engaged with them. We're in a waiting pattern with CATA, with MDOT, our TSC manager switched over, so we're engaging with the new manager to get back on to what the timelines are. But I think we met with them maybe a month or month and a half ago. We're trying to stay in front of them. Since that you mentioned that we want to be in on the front end and be a part of it, so they're still, I think, getting organized. Like I said, they're still in the scoping. Not privy to their entire process, but they haven't really started the design or the planning and that type of thing yet. So
It makes sense, and I don't know where the CATA lines are even after the presentation completely, but I agree they're talking about running them, further to the east. My thought is, hey, forget this plan. Delta's going to attract more housing to help support Amazon and the battery plant in the future years. And if that ties into our vision and there's housing and or businesses that are going to be associated with the corridor to help take advantage of those, to Tony's point, the more we can help CATA realize that and say, we think there's going to be housing or major employers down here. Can we, build that stops into the plan.
Yeah.
I guess that's the magic that we're all hoping we can help create, but.
I think we should look to it, like if Chris came out, like what the composition is of the CIA board, if there's more than one position that's open. Because there is a certain percentage, some of it has to be property owner or business owner on the corridor. There's also kind of at-large seats, so if that opportunity comes up, it could be, we want somebody from CATA to sit actually on the group. Or if that's not available and you want to start undertaking the corridor plan efforts, you could enlarge your group almost as a steering committee and then have them in the room at the same time talking about these things. So I think there's some ways to like really intentionally engage them so that they're literally at the table with you for these discussions.
I would just suggest if you want the influence, you gotta get ahead of it. You gotta be proactive, and it's all, I mean,
Early on.
just my recommendation would be typically, once you put something in front of somebody, they have to react to it. And if you don't put nothing in front of them, they're gonna just go ahead. And then you're always catching up. You're always playing that game. So take it for what it's worth.
And the good thing is we are already on record with them, kind of letting them know that we want to be involved. And we have this corridor improvement authority and we want to be engaged. So they know that now. So I think that we've gotten ahead of them. So I think as they move forward, they're going to be in that consultation.
Speaking of that, are you guys getting any pushback or spirited questions about the changing dynamics? And I know you're covering it at the board meeting tonight of Delta crossings, and obviously people bought into taking a little less tax revenue to defer for that. Or is there anybody who's nervous about it or challenging?
Well, I think people are probably nervous about whether or not it's going to ever be developed as it was envisioned. That we're not getting any pushback per se, like from the other taxing
Like the
authorities.
libraries or the county or.
Supposed to be, all this growth, that's not gonna, but, they're gonna give up the growth anyway, so I don't think that it really impacts them, obviously, from a financial point of view, but that's, part of the discussion in our board meeting tonight. Board members are obviously concerned about what it means, if it's gonna be developed and when and everything, and of course, the public continues to wonder too, on social media, you continually see the comments and the discussions in terms of what's that half-finished building that sits there?
Cement wall building. right?
Once a week, you see the comments, where are they building in front of BJ's? So the public obviously is still interested and want to know what's going on and everything there and stuff. So it will continue to have interest. We just have to see what all the lawsuits will,
Crazy.
I have a feeling the lawsuits will mean the property is just gonna be tied up for quite a while. I don't see anything happening there, to be honest, but time will tell. Well, we're getting close to our end of our time, so we should wrap up. So if there's not anything else, we can move to an adjournment. I do think next year, I do recommend that we originally talked about meeting in a smaller room because, we have conversations. That's what we do here. We just have conversations and discussion. Now that we have over a year of experience, we're not filling the room with spectators. Nobody's turning on the Zoom. So
We're pretty boring, is what you're trying to say.
next year we can move across the hallway. We can still be on Zoom so people can watch, even though nobody has over the past God knows how long. But I don't think there's a need to sit on this big dais with a big empty room every meeting. We can sit in a smaller room, we can look at each other and continue our discussion. So I think that's what we'll do in the new year. We'll just start meeting across. And obviously, if there's a meeting that we envision having more
Sure.
public input, we can have them in here.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense.
So does anybody have any final things before we adjourn? Okay, we'll see you in no further business. And I'll bang the gavel, then hand the gavel over to Peggy from here on out. So see you in no further business before us. We are adjourned.
Congrats, Peggy.
It's all yours, Peggy.
Good luck.